The Democracy That Delivers podcast is brought to you today by the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at SIPE. This is the podcast where we talk about corruption in its many forms. And now to your host, Frank Brown.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Democracy That Delivers podcast, brought to you today by the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at SIPE, which is the Center for International Private Enterprise. My name is Frank Brown. I'm the director of the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center, and I'm very happy to be joined today by Louisa Ayvazyan and Eric Hacopian, both joining us from Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. Louisa is the head of office of SIPE's Armenia branch, and Eric is a political analyst and the host of a show called Insights with Eric Hacopian, which covers the main events of the week in and around Armenia. He's been hosting that for a couple of years. It appears weekly on CivilNet television in English, Armenian, and Russian. Welcome, Louisa.
Thank you, Frank. Happy to join the podcast.
And Eric, it's good to have you here as well.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you both for being here. As you both certainly know, but the listeners perhaps don't, the genesis for this podcast was a recent visit by DC anti-corruption specialists visiting Armenia, looking into the situation there regarding anti-corruption and getting to know the myriad of programs that SIPE has around the issues of beneficial ownership transparency and other ways of implementing the country's anti-corruption strategy. One of the more interesting things I found during that visit was the degree to which Armenia appears to have largely conquered and significantly eliminated petty corruption. I wanted to get your comments, Eric, on that assertion. But first, Louisa, get a sense from you. Does that match with your reality there on the ground? So, Eric, what I'd like to ask you to start off the podcast to get us a sense of where we stand is that observation accurate? Has petty corruption significantly been reduced in Armenia in the past few years?
Yes, I think reduction is the right word, not eliminated. I think we're slowly moving away when it comes to, first of all, we need to understand that all kinds of corruption is bad. So when I give differentiation, it does not mean that any form is good or we're approving it of any of it. But we're going from what I call opportunity killing corruption or petty corruption, which sort of disrupts people's lives. Opportunity killing is, someone won't allow you to start a business and essentially it kills the economy and the ability of people to take care of themselves. And we're moving towards more of the traditional, what passes for traditional corruption in the world, which is what I call access corruption. I.e., there's a law that's passed, and because of my connections, I get to apply to do something earlier than other people. There's a regulatory thing that is favorable to me, which is quite, having worked in American politics, unfortunately, that's fairly common even there, and not just, it's somewhat international. So I think that the kind of corruption that sort of impacts people's lives, and one of them has been, frankly, the reform of the police force. Because once you have a professional police force and they're paid decent salaries, a lot of the petty corruption of being stopped and bothered by law enforcement has vastly decreased. So I think to answer your question, yes, progress has been made, but it is in no way the end of the story, and there's always lots more to do on all fronts.
So one of the things that's most interesting to me when a country is able to significantly reduce the kind of corruption you're describing is why. So I can think of a few other countries that are former Soviet countries that have accomplished this or are perceived to have accomplished this. So Estonia and Georgia come to mind. Armenia, for our listeners, if you don't mind describing a little bit, Eric, has been in recent years fighting corruption on many different levels in a way that it never had before. It's obviously in a pretty rough neighborhood between Iran and Russia, surrounded by some fairly corrupt states and with tremendous pressure in favor of corruption, not against it. Could you describe a little bit how this happened?
I think democratization is married to anti-corruption. They're always the exceptional models, the Singapores of the world, but I never liked those models because the world is not full of Lee Kuan Yews, So around the world, in most, especially non-Asian cultures, it's anti-corruption movements are usually married to the form of democratization. Not that guarantees it. I mean, you have countries like Italy that have tremendous amounts of corruption that have been democracies for 80 years. But generally the same forces that bring about democratization, which happened in 2003 in Georgia with the Rose Revolution, in 2018 in Armenia with the Velvet Revolution, are the same kind of forces. In fact, the revolutions are driven by the fact that you want to get away from corruption, specifically the opportunity killing kind. So I think the external factors are somewhat not particularly relevant when it comes to internal approaches. But I think this is one of the key things. You guys work on all of these programs and they're all very useful. However, none of them match or as relevant as a people's desire for change or a people's desire not to live in a corrupt society. And more importantly, the will. And by the way, as you know, this is not a one-time, one-size-fit-all. You don't win the battle in one round. Sometimes you move forward, sometimes you move back. It's a constant struggle. But what matters is that systematically you are moving in another direction. And I think the second leg of it's not just democratization, is actually once you reach middle income status, fighting corruption becomes a lot easier because at the end of the day, if you have state employees in any country that make $200 a month compared to a normal salary of $800 to $1,000 a month, which is you can live on in Armenia, is the road to corruption. So prosperity, it's like this: the better you do, the less corrupt you can become because you can afford not to be corrupt. So I think it's economic growth on the one hand and democratization, and once that's married to political will, that's far more relevant than any outside pressure or programs. However, outside pressures and programs are very important because they set the standard and expectations and bring the practical effect of history from other places.
Interesting. And so one of the things that caught my ear right there was when you accurately described the fact that this is never done. This is an ongoing process, and that one of the reasons it's successful is when people push for change and when they're trying to better themselves economically. And that then turns to precisely the sort of work that the Center for International Private Enterprise is doing on the ground in Armenia. And I wanted to go for a quick comment from the head of the Armenian branch, who's joined us, Louisa Abazian. Louisa, could you describe a little bit, in your work with the business community in Armenia, what role does the anti-corruption dimension play in their engagement in the overall democratic structure?
Yes.
What sort of work do you do?
Thank you, Frank. So just a short observation from our side. We have recently noticed that the private sector has started to play a much important role in this anti-corruption direction of the country, because up to now all the policies, all the reforms that have been implemented in the country didn't have that much influence and engagement from the private sector. But what we are seeing nowadays, for example, the recent processes of approving the new anti-corruption strategy of the country, that's the first time that the private sector has so much space in this anti-corruption strategy. That's the first time that the government has implemented, for example, needs assessment, the assessment of risks in between of the relations of the private sector and the public administration. That never happened. The anti-corruption strategies of the country never had this kind of risk assessment of the private sector in regards to the public administration. So we think that this is something new for the country, and the private sector will soon have much more to say and to play a more important role in the process. Another thing that we observe is that from the perspective of the private sector, it becomes more interested in ethics and business integrity. So we have this observation because we have recently established the Business Integrity Club, and we do have so many private sector representatives there who really want to fight corruption and who really want to become ethical and to have all this integrity in place so that they can attract investment from abroad.
So one of my things that I'd like to ask you, Eric, is following up on Louisa's point. The private sector obviously is not a monolith, and there are elements of the private sector that do benefit from corruption, and they do benefit from the status quo. So what, Eric, in your opinion, changed in Armenia where you had some elements of the private sector pushing for what Louisa is describing, and other elements retreating, taking a back seat, or not being as active in fighting anti-corruption efforts? What changed?
It's two letters, I and T. The IT sector in Armenia, which by the nature of the business, is entirely integrated into the world economy, because unless you're selling in, France and Germany and the United States, you're not in business, is becoming, even though numerically it, employs on the low end about 30,000, I suspect a lot more because there's so many people who work independently. It has an oversized impact. Very much like in Israel, by the way, it's a similar model. Israel is actually a very wealthy country, but the wealth is also very concentrated into fewer. The people who earn high incomes is actually a small number of people. So the IT industry, the level of wealth and money that those people make, eventually they overwhelm the traditionally, if you in 1995 had the road to fame and fortune was having the monopoly to import sugar into the country. If you're a subcontractor for Google, what those people made in a year, you can make in a month. So it's the level of, and if you are involved in world business, trading with the world, and you need the rule of law, you cannot tolerate that kind of like petty, stupid corruption where the whims of this one person, can interrupt things or your business dealings with the world. So I think some of this is frankly the nature of the businesses. And this is one of the advantages of frankly not having easily exploitable natural resources in many ways, is because what I'm describing is almost impossible to do in a natural resource-based economies, because if you have an economy like that, you really don't care, and it feeds into corruption. Well, if you don't have that, you need to be integrated into the world in what I would call normalized business systems. Corruption just has, listen, there'll always be certain levels of corruption, and it's not like Western companies are beyond doing corruption things in China or India or anywhere. They will. There's always cases of you bribe this minister, and that always exists. But in day-to-day dealings, you need the rule of law, and you can't have the type of corruption that's corrosive to an economy or economic dealings.
So it sounds to me that because Armenia has reached a critical mass of engagement with the global IT sector, that's been a powerful driver in the anti-corruption reforms and improvement generally. And I know, Eric, when you mention rule of law, I immediately think to something, Louise, I believe you work on, which is beneficial ownership transparency, because obviously it's very difficult to comply with global standards and laws if you don't know who owns what companies. Can you, Louisa, talk a little bit about why that's important and what effect that's had so far on the Armenian private sector?
Yes, Frank, SAIP has been recently engaged in this beneficial ownership reform, trying to explain to the private sector why this matters and why this is a positive step forward, though the reform has several gaps and it's just the beginning, so we still have a long way to go to correspond to international standards. So we do have still some problems while implementing the reform. But the thing is that the process started, as far as we know, from the mining sector. So because we have so many mining companies here, and then this will be a question that I would like to ask Eric about how he thinks the mining sector influences the corruption. But we started with the mining sector, and as of now, all the companies in Armenia, including the private ones, the media, and the NGOs, they have to declare their beneficial owners, and for sure in the registry. And this is something positive because later for the investments to the country, we can make sure that those investments will be constructive and not corrosive. So we're trying to explain the private sector that this is an important tool forward, because the private sector as of now doesn't understand this. They don't know why the reform is needed, what are the benefits of the reform. So we are here to be kind of a mediator to help the government make all the benefits from the reform and to engage the private sector in the process.
I think I'm very interested actually by the fact that she mentioned mining, and this is very key. Mining is the only place where Armenia, has natural resources type corruption, and it is horrendous. Historically, mining in this country has been, it's a den of thieves, where for the most part, even today with these reforms, smart enough lawyers, they can hide who owns what. In many cases, we don't know who owns what. We can guess, the former president owns this or that. So mining has actually been a disastrous area in which, in so many ways, the country has been ripped off of a lot of resources that could have gone into other developments. Armenia is actually a very significant copper producer in the world. And so I think that mining bit is quite important. Unfortunately, I'm afraid to say that mining in this part of the world is where typical post-Soviet, post-communist corruption meets absurdist World Bank, sort of the more extreme end of the neoliberal agenda, in which you're forcing essentially giveaways to the private sector, where the people, the government gets 2.5% of ownership, or the government gets just taxes, when there's billions of dollars being cleared and the government gets a very small share of it. And it's almost this ideologically driven thing, which might actually be quite proper in a place like Canada or Australia. But in this part of the world, it means empowering some of the worst people in this part of the world. So we've had this mining reform is key, because it can literally make a difference in the billions on the country's budget and the ability to do things. And it's probably the single most significant reform, anti-corruption reform you can do, is to fix mining in this country, which is also, frankly, politically very risky, because it will engage most likely not only the bad actors in this country, but bad actors from some of our nearby countries. You can use your imagination. So some of these, they're not owned by people from Tahiti, let's just say. So this is it's a hornet's nest, but it's a critical hornet's nest to deal with.
Just to add to what Eric said, that's where the beneficial ownership reform started. So back several years ago, this was a serious concern for especially the civil society. And according to the beneficial ownership reform, just the mining companies were the ones to declare their beneficial owners. And I guess there are 26 mining companies, if I'm not mistaken, and all the information about their beneficial owners is published with details, and everyone can read this in the registry. Whereas for other companies, for other private companies and NGOs, in order to get the information on the beneficial owners, like the citizens have to pay. Whereas for the mining sector representatives, the information is free of charge. So I just think that at least something is being implemented to somehow adjust the sector. But that's a good comparison, where when we mentioned for Armenia the IT sector from one direction and the mining companies from other. So these are two opposite realities of the country.
Just wanted to remind listeners that we're joined today by Luisa Ayvazyan, who's the head of the Armenian branch of site operations, and Eric Hacopian, who's a political analyst and consultant, and he's also the host of a weekly show on CivilNet television called Insights with Eric Hacopian. Eric, I wanted to pick up on something you said, or at least sort of hinted at, and that is that one size does not fit all when it comes to fighting corruption. And so something cooked up in Washington at the World Bank regarding the mining sector might not be a good fit for Armenia. And that raises a larger question within the anti-corruption community, because folks are always looking for ways to replicate success. So people are always looking for what the secret sauce might have been in Armenia that could be applied in other former Soviet countries or elsewhere in the world. From your point of view, where you sit, and obviously you're quite worldly, you lived in a bunch of different countries, you're a keen observer of what's happening in Armenia. What is that secret sauce? Or is that a mistake to think there is such a thing?
There is a secret sauce, but then that secret sauce, as I stated earlier, is democracy and prosperity. If you really, good luck fighting corruption in Sierra Leone until it gets to a certain level of income. I mean, you can say it, you can have programs, but when a police officer makes $15 a month, you cannot expect that police officer not to take bribes. That's just natural. That's just the human order of things. So if there's a secret sauce, it is, how do you rev up democracy and how do you rev up prosperity on a minimal level? On prosperity, I'm not talking about Switzerland. I'm talking about people having a normal life. So I think that this, as far as the secret sauce, that's the secret sauce, which is universal, because that's what I can say it unites every culture in every part of the world, because you see a similar pattern when you have a certain level of prosperity, when you have a certain level of democracy. Most of these things are possible no matter what part of the world you're in. But the rest of it, frankly, is all quite variable. And I think this is where, for example, every year, if you look at the list, the corruption list, China and Nigeria are on top of the list. But you cannot in any fair way say that their development models are the same or their accomplishments are the same. China has first or second biggest economy in the world, and Nigeria has underperformed for many, many years. So I think the issue is, I go back to, when you're looking at corruption, is how do you triage to eliminate the worst of it? And the worst corruption is what what prevents economic development: monopolization, feudalism. In Armenia, for example, I give you an example. Before the revolution, we had oligarchy in the big cities, and we had feudalism in the rural areas, in the sense that there were political bosses that could tell you, you could open up this restaurant, you can't open up this restaurant. You could open up this car wash, and you can't open up this car wash because some person that is connected to me owns it. And you cannot imagine what transformative effect that has once that dead hand of corruption is lifted. I mean, to be honest with you, that's the most gratifying thing, because when you sit in your offices, corruption it's not an esoteric thing on that level. If I'm living in a village in Armenia and suddenly I can open up a restaurant in my backyard, and that allows me to make $700 a month rather than $200. That's the difference between my daughter getting, her teeth fixed on getting brackets, and my son going to the university, or half a dozen different things. So we cannot think of corruption in these. You have to think of it in real people terms. So when you think about it in real people terms, what you really want to focus on is what is it how do you eliminate, first and foremost, opportunity killing corruption? Because once you lift that dead hand out of the lives of ordinary people anywhere in the world, the one thing that's consistent is that human beings everywhere, frankly, are more than capable of taking care of themselves without dramatic, they need less help than we think they do. They've proven.
You're touching here upon something that I've observed but haven't been able to articulate, and that is that there's a tremendous entrepreneurial drive among Armenian people that I've encountered, both in Armenia and in the diaspora, whether it's in Moscow or Boston or Los Angeles or Lebanon, even Sudan recently. And that entrepreneurial drive, when it's thwarted, right, when there's a barrier to realizing your potential as an entrepreneur, Armenians, obviously, or anybody doing that, aren't happy and will try to change things. And I'm wondering, Louisa, that's something we discussed briefly during my visit to Yerevan recently. I'm wondering, as somebody who focuses on the business community, are there elements of the business community's drive for reform to be more efficient, to cut out these needless, corrupt bureaucrats? Are there elements of that are exportable to other parts of the world? I don't even mean in sort of an academic, scientific way, but just based on your own observations. What drives people to take action?
Yeah, I will say that from our recent relations with the business, something maybe that's not the concrete answer to your question, but what we observed, and this can be successfully exported to other countries, especially to the regional ones from the Caucasus, is that it's very easy to register a business here. So from the bureaucratic point of view, for the business representatives, it's an ideal place. So you can register a business within a day, and then there are no problems with the state authorities, with the state registry's office. So everything is in place here from this point of view. And what drives the private sector to engage in the process is that there are no any challenges created by the state, and the taxes, they are not that high, but there is something that the private sector has to learn from other countries. So what we observed is, from the point of view of collective action initiatives, we still have so many things to learn from other countries. I would be very happy to say that this is something that we can export, but no, this is something that we can import to the country. So the businesses are not collected, and we don't have this collective action coming from the private sector, unfortunately. But so SIPE is here to support the private sector to do this.
I think you touched on something that was vital, and I think this is one of the most difficult thing, because this is where culture and history meet economics and politics and reform. The Armenians are one of the few, what I call the middlemen cultures in the world. It's the Jews, it's the Armenians, it's the overseas Indians, and the overseas Chinese. And they have been successful everywhere, and they have been hated everywhere, mostly for being successful. So there is something in this being an outlier people where you have to find your way on the margins. But in the context of capitalism, those margins become the dominant sectors. So people who were peddling things end up being the Rothschilds. So that's deeply immersed. It's almost a DNA type of thing. There's actually a phrase for it in Armenian where you don't know what someone does, and they'll say he pieces things together. And why is this relevant? Is because in today's culture, in today's international economy, especially in the post-COVID one, what actually is a problem in France and Germany and the United States, in the sense that people do not have the steady 40-year working the same type of setup, is it's a completely normal thing for a group like the Armenians, for example, because that's what they're used to. And they actually thrive in the new economy. And one of the reasons that the IT sector has done well in Armenia is actually cultural in nature, because the basic building of Armenian culture is actually, it's like an anarchist collective. So that Silicon Valley libertarian thing where, me and my 10 friends go off and do something is deeply embedded into the culture. So that culture, sometimes gives you advantages, sometimes gives you disadvantages. And culture in a context like this comes from very unique historical experiences. But once you're a people that's forcefully scattered around the world, you're not going to become a government bureaucrat. You're going to become a middleman. And today's economic world is the world of middlemen.
So this is a wonderful setup to what will have to be my final question for both of you, because we're running out of time, unfortunately. And that is, given what Eric and Luis, I think you're both describing, is an unusual Armenian propensity for fighting corruption on the private sector level for a host of cultural, historical, and probably geographical reasons. Given that, so these are sort of cultural forces that are moving in that direction. And we also have big market forces, which are have to do with Armenia's location and assets it has, whether it's mining assets or IT assets. And then there are all sorts of geopolitical factors. And the war in Ukraine comes to mind, the relationship with Turkey, the relationship with Iran. These are all big factors. These are powerful drivers of the anti-corruption landscape in Armenia, which an NGO like SIPE, a mid-sized NGO, can't move substantially. So my question to both of you is, given all those forces, what is the best way for Western agencies and governments and NGOs to continue to support what's happening in Armenia, the Armenian anti-corruption success story, and to learn from it, to export it? Or is that just too tall an order? So I'll go to you first, Louisa, and then to you, Eric. So the question is, given all these big, powerful forces that are applied to Armenia when it comes to corruption, what can our part of the equation bring to the table? What can we do?
The first thing is at least not to leave the country, because there are not so many NGOs and civil society representatives in Armenia that support the private sector. Most of them support the civil society. So there are rare organizations that help the private sector. So the thing that SIPE and similar NGOs are in Armenia is already positive. And even the small projects and programs that are implemented is already something, it's a positive step forwards for the country. So I would say just to share the lessons learned and the good experience, but not just bring projects and programs here, but trying to adapt these projects and programs to Armenian reality and culture. Because just bringing the projects will not help the situation. We really need to start to adapt the approaches that have been positive in other countries.
Well, I think one of the things that's key is Western donors and Western organizations in this part of the world have a tendency to fall in love with individual political figures, which is the wrong approach to things. You need to be demanding, tough, have high standards no matter who's in power, and you need to support the reform process rather than individual political leaders. So, and I think, it is not about individuals. Individuals don't make reform. It is political systems that need to be reformed. And it's movements and people that make reforms. And lastly, and I think this is key, and especially in countries that are in hard, one of the reasons, frankly, and this motivates so many things in Armenia, not just this, but different reform projects. If you are a small country surrounded by hostile neighbors, technically you can't even afford to be corrupt. We went through a war in which you can tie corruption to dead 18, 19-year-olds. That will wake you up more than anything else. You cannot afford to be corrupt. And I'm sure there are other countries, the larger the country, Saudi Arabia can have corruption. They'll live through next day. We can't afford it.
So that's a perfect way to end this podcast. It's succinct. It's right to the point. It captures the private sector dimension of all this, that Armenia cannot afford to be corrupt. So that's a great takeaway. I want to thank you both for taking the time, for digging into a sensitive subject, and for the work you both do in Armenia. Once more, for our listeners, we've been interviewing two specialists from Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. The first, Eric Hacopian, who's a political analyst and consultant. He's the host of the weekly show on CivilNet television in English, Armenian, and Russian, and he examines the week's events both in Armenia and around the world. And we've also been pleased to have been joined by Louisa Ayvazyan, who's the head of the Armenian branch of the Center for International Private Enterprise. Eric and Louisa, a pleasure to have you with us, and I hope you'll come back soon. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit cipe.org.